All right, so it's mango month, and we thought we'd take a little moment and kind of look at some of the fruit trees we grow here at the garden. You may have heard of the farm. That's down in Homestead, where Fairchild grows all sorts of diversity really for production. But ever since the beginning of the garden, we've been showing fruit trees. And so I want to start right at the entrance. We're here, right coming in the visitor center. And historically, this whole area was the Arboretum. And so unlike the rest of the garden, from here to the overlook, things were laid out pretty much by family. You don't see in other parts. In other parts, we have a rainforest plants. Maybe we'll have the spiny forest of Madagascar, so it's a particular area. This area was historically taxonomic, and you don't see it quite as much anymore. And this entryway is mainly about flowers and show, but you still see some of the original plantings, a lot of which are edible trees. And so right off the bat, this is a plant from the first 10 years. It was 1941. And this is a close relative of mangosteen, and it's typically called African mangosteen. It's not in fruit right now, but it's a tasty little fruit, very different from what you'd think mangosteen, if you've ever had a true mangosteen. But same genus, a huge genus, a lot of fruit trees. And so here we are, just walking right in. We have our first old fruit tree that produces fruit every year. It just dropped them recently. So as we start coming into the garden and into the Arboretum, you start seeing a lot of different fruit trees. And you may not notice the fruit trees, because most of the time when people visit, they're not in fruit. But this is a great plant, and this is a Patomba. It's a Eugenia. So the Myrtaceae family, really a great fruit, small yellow, tastes just like apricots, but very slow. So this thing was actually from 1941. So that gives you the age and kind of the style. But the Myrtaceae has a lot of different fruit trees, and even right the next plant we have is what usually people think of as the family, which is the guava family. You can see this does have some fruit developing. This is more of a local variety from Homestead. It's actually called Homestead. It's a hybrid produced in South Florida. But again, they're kind of used as plantings, and a lot of the structure in the Arboretum are edible trees. And as we sort of walk through the Myrtaceae, we've got a whole history of different collectors. And this one right here is actually in full fruit, and it's a wax Jamboo, which can do really well here in South Florida. And this is a variety that was brought in by the late, great Bill Whitman, a big fruit collector here. And so you can actually see the fruit dropping. A little hard to grow things like an orchard when you have an Arboretum. This is going to become a very tall shade tree, so you tend to drop a lot of the fruits. This is a pretty good variety. It's pink and green. But again, in an orchard, we'd keep the trees much shorter so we can collect the fruit more easily. But still, it's a nice variety, and it's one that there's a lot of new varieties being produced in Asia and elsewhere, and so we keep experimenting with new types. And actually near the children's garden, we have some new forms of this that we planted recently. But as we kind of continue, Merciaria from the 20s, a different kind of tropical fruit related to Jaboticaba. Up here we have another wax Jamboo. It's also in fruit. So you start getting the feeling that even though it's an Arboretum, there's a lot of history to try and get the interesting edibles mixed in and out here. And while these are older trees, we do continue to plant new ones. And so we're now going to walk through a little bit, see some new plantings as well as some old, see a little bit more of the fruit diversity that people may not realize, because then this next thing that doesn't edible. And without really knowing what they are and checking labels, people don't necessarily recognize what is edible and what isn't. So here we're now at another wax Jamboo. And again, these are the same species, it's just different cultivated varieties, just like you think of like apples. And we kind of see the difference of what these two ones look like. We have a greener one with stripe, a little pinker, and the pinker one's from right behind me. And you can see it's highly productive. It's producing fruit all over the place. They're dropping quickly. But they're pretty tasty. They're just a hand fruit, really popular in Southeast Asia. A bit like an apple, actually crunchy, doesn't have any seeds. A really refreshing fruit. And they keep having more and more varieties coming out. And some of them now are really large and really are apple-like. So it's got a great future, and they seem to grow really well here in South Florida. There's actually been a problem. It produces so much fruit, it can have a lot of branches break. So another reason, as we'll look at later with some of our newer plantings, to keep them very small, rather than Arboretum setting, sort of show how to maintenance trees for a typical backyard grower. We're still right near the entrance of the garden, right on the tram path. And this is actually a new tree we planted right after Irma. We had lost a ceiba, so we had a spot. And we went with another type of edible tree. And this is actually a species of ficus. This is Ficus ariculata, which is it's got an interesting story. When we think of you go to a store, you get a fig, right? That's the Mediterranean style fig. They're delicious. They're kind of different fruit. But most of the tropical figs they won't ripen that fig unless they have a particular type of wasp to pollinate it. A fig is actually a group of fruits. It's strange, synconium. So Ficus auriculata has been grown a lot, but it would never set fruit because it didn't have the right wasp. The other problem is if you end up even getting the wasp, sometimes it can be a bit buggy. They do lay eggs in there and things. But this is actually one. That wasp doesn't occur here in South Florida, but this one ripens without the wasp. And so it's actually quite tasty. This one's almost ripe, not quite, but they're about this size and red. And when you open it, I've tasted it, it's a bit like a kind of a typical fig, fresh fig crossed with a strawberry. Most people know I think it's pretty tasty. And again, it's growing very quickly. This is about 3 years. I'm getting even a better one here. Here we go, now we're talking. And this is kind of what they look like ripe. And they have sort of a hard skin, but I'll try to open it. You can see it's kind of a nice red, but this again will be a new thing. And this is a plant actually brought in from Sri Lanka by the late Larry Shockman, who ran the Kampong for a long time. And this is the sort of thing David Fairchild, Dr. Fairchild himself, would always try to collect and bring in. It's kind of new fruits and new ways to eat them. So this is now a new tasty fig that we're kind of optimistic about here for South Florida. It seems to grow really well and is worth trying. Still in the Arboretum, now we're in kind of the Ebonacea plot. Think of ebony, nice dark heavy woods. And this is actually a true Dr. Fairchild introduction from the Cheng Ho expedition in 1940. And so he brought in seeds of Diospyros, different species. When you think of Diospyros, that's the classic persimmon genus. It's often called black sapote, a bit misleading. It's not a sapote, not in that same group. So sometimes it's called black persimmon or chocolate persimmon. Pretty tasty, but this is one of the original ones he brought in. And it's worth mentioning, not all Diospyros are edible. And this is where I don't recommend going around just trying fruits anywhere. They actually have another one next to it, Maritima, he also brought in. It turns out that that fruit is really caustic. You can't eat it. But this one's actually pretty good, but very pudding-like. It does well, and it also makes a pretty good shade tree. We're just a few steps away from the Ebonacea. Now we're into the Rutaceae, which is the whole citrus family. Now we do have a few new citrus we planted. We have a Citrus hystrix, and maybe a key lime, a little orange hybrid. But they're younger plants. But a lot of times citrus can be tricky here in South Florida. They don't necessarily like the limestone, they like the deep sands of Central Florida. And of course, it's a huge industry here in South Florida. The whole history of canker and different diseases, people are really protective of that industry. But there's some other ones here that grow. And this one's always productive, so it's just an easy one to just check out. It's called limeberry. It's a triphasia. And it's just always in fruit. It fruits constantly all the time. And definitely it's got a bit of a sour twang, but it's not a bad little berry you can eat on. People sometimes use it for cooking or jams and this sort of thing. This is something that's just here, just another edible right nearby. It does have a big seed, and the seeds are green. Actually, almost all citrus, if you cut the seed open, it's green inside. So it's actually kind of a curious family character. But as we walk through, we just kind of are seeing these little edible trees spread throughout the Arboretum. Just walked a few more steps, and since we were looking at kind of smaller fruits and berries, I think this is a fun one to plant out. And we actually just planted this last year, and you can see it's grown up to a nice kind of shrub, small tree. And it is a strawberry tree called Mantingia. It's in its own family, but it's kind of laid out here with the Malvalian groups. It's got these little berries, and it produces them constantly year-round. And they're very sweet, pretty flavorful. It's sort of popular. It's a good area, I think, for a children's garden kind of around because they're low-growing and tasty. We actually did plant it in the children's garden. I like to keep some browsing food around available at the garden. We haven't moved far. We're right here on the tram path, right coming off the visitor center, and we have some trees of a really curious genus called Antidesmo. This is something Fairchild had collected. What's bizarre about it is these kind of little drupes, they begin to ripen to red. They're not ripe yet. When they're ripe, people generally think they either taste great or very bitter. And there was actually a study done with some people here at the garden decades ago, and they made pies and see who could eat and didn't. It came out to about 10–15% of the population taste bitter when they eat them. And this is when we realize it's fun to get cultivated varieties and really start to produce things that taste good to everyone. So it's not a domesticated, but I think they're delicious, and they really produce a lot of these little fruits. It's sort of noteworthy. Some people just find them repulsively bitter, but the majority of people like them. It's sort of a novelty, quirky when you're on the edge of edible. Before this garden even existed, it was a fruit grove, and so if you're in the southern Palmetto, you'll also see really old mangoes. There's a very old sapote. There's even an old mamey that had died some years ago, but those are really old trees that predate the garden. You look through some of the new introductions, and And then we did a new planting here of fruit trees. And this is an area that was always kind of open. If you remember back some years, there were a couple little hills and some vines, a little tough to manage. So we decided to go with some new fruit trees and a new style of planting. And basically we ended up working with the Rare Fruit Council, which is a really fun society if you're into fruits here in South Florida. And working with the president, Dr. Matt Snow, we started looking at what would be a fun little group of fruit trees to show. Let's kind of hit the different types and keep them small year after year. Maybe we even have pruning, like how to prune trees every year. We haven't pruned them yet because it's a new planting. But basically each one's a different type of tropical fruit tree and of some sort of variety that we thought was really interesting or fun for any reason. Again, this is not really production, it's more of an exhibition, a different way of growing them, rather than the arboretum or the big old mangoes, which are beautiful, but they're huge. Very hard to get mangoes off a huge tree. So in this case, we're gonna try and keep them a little more formal and small, kind of separate the tram path from the vine pergola, and have a little place where people can see different kinds of fruit trees laid out very clearly in one spot. So most of these are pretty young. They haven't set any fruit yet, though a couple have. This here is actually a cashew, which is sort of fun. And right off the bat, you may go, well, I don't know if that's really a fruit tree. But if you've ever actually seen cashews growing, it's incredibly bizarre because the actual fruit looks just like the cashew, but it's that base that inflates, and it's called a cashew apple. And it actually, you can eat it fresh. You can see in some stores, they'll sell it as juice. It doesn't ship well, but you can buy cashew apple juice in the stores, depending where you go. So I think it's kind of a novelty and a fun one to teach with. Can you kind of see the cashew separate from this accessory fruit, which is actually from the receptacle, or even the pedestal. So kind of a fun one to grow, to kind of see where cashews come from. A lot of people don't see that. We have to have an avocado. It's coming in, starting to grow pretty well. And this is actually a Russell, which is pretty fun variety. I actually have a friend who grows one. I love eating them. They're a great salad variety. You chop them up, they don't squish. You can toss them in a salad. Really nice. I think a lot of people get hung up in the store that there's kind of the Haas and the smooth green one, and that's it. There's a lot of avocados out there. There's about 100 varieties being grown at the farm, if not more, down at Fairchild. And many of them can have that nice oiliness with different skins and shapes. The interesting about the Russell is that it's very long and narrow. These things can be, I don't know, 16 inches or so, something like this. It looks almost like a squash or a zucchini on a tree, which is kind of its novelty, but it's still a really tasty, high quality avocado that we thought was worth trying. Annonas, you know, more of the tropical groups. You think of sugar apple, and that's what we have here. And there's a lot of different varieties of sugar apple. This is Annona squamosa, but this is the Kampong mauve. And if we think of Kampong, that was the historical house of David Fairchild, right down the street. It's also the emblem of the Rare Fruit Council. So they thought that would be fun. They really wanted to see this tree being grown. And again, this is something we actually don't have another example of it in the garden. So this is our only one. Try to keep as much diversity in the garden so we don't have too much replicates. This is gonna be our sugar apple here in the garden. So now we're walking towards the center, and of course, mango is always important. And so we planted one in here recently. We actually got this from Excalibur Fruit Trees. They sell a lot of large ones. And this is a variety that was named here at the garden by Dr. Richard Campbell for Angie Whitman. It's called the Angie Mango. A really classic, nice, built off the hybrid of Hayden's, but with no fiber, really nice mango. So we also want to try out some different new varieties. This is a longan, kind of a relative of the lychee, if you know these. Longans can do really well here in South Florida. A new cultivar. It's sometimes called Chandra, after the man he's from Indonesia. He tracked it down up the Mekong Delta when he heard about a red leaf longan. And so this ended up being introduced into Florida. And these are some of the first plants going, and actually it looks like we're gonna actually have fruit going on this little tree. But it's kind of remarkable for its color. Obviously, it's not always gonna be in fruit, but having something on display to kind of show how different colors can be and forms is kind of fun, and it's a brand new variety. We do want to try new things here, and this is a place where we can do it. So this will be a first for us, a red longan. So this is another Annona, but a different species. This is what you think of guanabana or soursop, the really big Annona americata. You know, the selection is typically called the South Florida form. It's one that's been grown. They can be a bit sensitive to cold, but this guy's done pretty well. For 1 year, even though we had down to 40, we're not having a big problem. Multiple nights though could set it back, but it usually springs right back in summer. And we've noticed that. We had maybe a big cold 10 years ago, but we're kind of moving ahead. We've had breadfruit surviving. We have one breadfruit out near the children's garden, near the Whitman Pavilion, and another one in the Arboretum. So we do plant some new trees out there, and actually they're doing great and they made it through the cold. So we may start having breadfruit as well. But we also look forward to trying soursops and guanabana here at the garden for the first time and actually get some fruit. If you're gonna have a mixture of trees, you just have to have a jackfruit. They're amazing trees. I think it's a bit contentious, much like the durian, if people like jackfruit, and it has that large fruit with that intense odor and smell. And I think of that the large mammal dispersal scent. I love it. I think it's amazing. I love durian. I love jackfruit. And if you've ever been by the Whitman Pavilion, you see we have that jackfruit out front. That's a black gold. It does really well, has great fruit, and people notice it when they walk by because it really does produce a huge amount of fruit. This is a variety we haven't tried before. It's a new variety called Orange Crush, but it's already grown pretty quickly, and I imagine it's going to be really productive. It's incredible how many hundreds of pounds of fruit one tree can produce. And as long as you can handle cleaning it, because it's very heavy in latex, I basically coat all my hands and knife in vegetable oil, cut it as fast as I can, and throw it all in the trash. But the fruit's amazing. So look forward to trying this. These fruits can range from white to red on the insides when you actually clean that flesh from white to red. And we're actually trying some white and red varieties also in the Arboretum because I'd love to see more different varieties of jackfruit around. And again, when people walk by, you see that developing. It's always an interesting show. We start off in the Arboretum looking at some of the oldest plantings that have been introduced from around the world. Lee spoke about some of the oldest fruit trees that predate the garden. And we saw some of the latest fruit trees. So we're still planting new varieties all the time, and then a whole new planting to show off new varieties. And there's so many edible fruit trees to talk about here. I just can't help mention Blimby, a curious fruit, really close relative of star fruit, which is also right behind me. And it is extremely sour. I don't know how people eat them, but I did plant a miracle fruit next to it, which is still a bush, not big enough. And if you've ever had miracle fruit or know it, it's a little red berry. And it doesn't taste like too much, but it impacts your flavor afterwards. It makes everything taste sweet. And so I like to grow them nearby and hopefully get them going so that people can try a Blimby, see how sour it is, eat a miracle fruit. And then you take a bite of the Blimby again, it tastes delicious. It's amazing. So we're always looking at ways to play around with fruits. We love them, and we're still planting them all over the garden.